Long before the written word carved history into stone or pressed it onto parchment, there was another way, a living, breathing thread of memory woven through the voices of countless generations. Picture a campfire under a sky thick with stars, the air humming with the cadence of a storyteller's voice as they spin tales of heroes, gods, and ancestors. This wasn't just entertainment, it was the heartbeat of entire cultures, the glue that held societies together. For thousands of years, oral tradition was the only way humanity preserved its collective memory, and the astonishing truth is, these spoken stories often survived with remarkable accuracy, outlasting empires and outliving languages. How did our ancestors achieve such a feat? What hidden techniques did they use to ensure these stories weren't lost to time? And why does this ancient practice still echo in our digital age? Think about the last time you heard a story so vivid, so charged with emotion that it stuck with you for days. Now imagine that story carrying the weight of centuries, passed down not through ink and paper, but through the rhythm of a voice, the cadence of a chant, the melody of a song. Oral tradition wasn't just about remembering, it was about feeling. Indigenous elders, West African griots, Celtic bards, they didn't recite tales, they performed them, embedding each word with gestures, music, and repetition designed to sear the story into the listener's mind. These weren't casual retellings, they were sacred acts of preservation, rituals where every syllable mattered, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Lose the story, and you might lose the wisdom of how to heal, how to navigate the stars, or how to honor the gods. Yet here's what's truly mesmerizing. These ancient techniques still shape how we communicate today. Ever caught yourself humming a jingle you heard years ago? That's the power of rhythm and repetition, the same tools our ancestors used to make stories unforgettable. From Homer's Odyssey, which survived hundreds of years purely through spoken word before being written down, to the rich folklore of Native American tribes that still teaches respect for the land, oral tradition is far from a relic. It's a testament to human ingenuity, a bridge between past and present that reminds us some truths are too vital to be left solely to the page. So let's trace this thread back through time, unraveling how voices alone carried the essence of who we are, and discovering why, even now, the oldest stories still have the power to move us. Imagine standing in a world without books, without libraries, without even the simplest written symbols to guide you. Every piece of knowledge how to track prey, which plants could heal or poison, where to find water in the driest seasons had to be carried in the mind and passed from one generation to the next through speech alone. This was the reality for our earliest ancestors, and the birth of oral tradition wasn't just a cultural choice, it was a necessity for survival. In the vast stretches of prehistory, before the first clay tablets or cave paintings, stories were the original textbooks, the original maps, the original laws. Take the indigenous peoples of Australia, whose oral traditions stretch back an astonishing 65,000 years. Their songlines, intricate narratives woven with landscape, astronomy, and ancestral knowledge acted as both spiritual guides and literal navigation systems. A single song could chart hundreds of miles of terrain, encoding the locations of waterholes, sacred sites, and seasonal food sources. These weren't just stories, they were living, breathing databases, meticulously preserved through rhythmic repetition and ceremonial performance. One misstep, one forgotten verse, could mean the difference between life and death for an entire community. But oral tradition didn't just preserve practical knowledge, it shaped the very fabric of human connection. In ancient cultures, storytelling was a communal act, a way to bind people together under shared values and collective memory. The Norse skalds didn't merely recount the deeds of gods and heroes. They reinforced the virtues of bravery and loyalty that held Viking society together. West African griots, often called living libraries, didn't just recite genealogies. They ensured that no ancestor's legacy was lost, no treaty's terms forgotten. These storytellers were more than entertainers. They were the guardians of identity, the keepers of a people's soul. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient methods mirror the way our brains are wired to remember. Modern science shows that information tied to emotion, rhythm, or melody is far more likely to stick. Just think of how easily song lyrics lodge in your mind compared to a plain paragraph of text. Our ancestors intuitively understood this, crafting stories with vivid imagery, repetitive refrains, and even physical gestures to make them unforgettable. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Tales of the Maori, the Dreamtime stories of Aboriginal Australians, all survived not in spite of their oral form, but because of it. They were designed to endure, to resonate, to be carried forward on the breath of every new generation. And here's the twist: even after writing emerged, oral tradition didn't vanish. It adapted. The Homeric epics, first sung by bards centuries before they were written down, retained their poetic meter because it made them easier to remember. In medieval Europe, troubadours kept history alive through ballads long after monasteries began scribing manuscripts. Orality and literacy didn't replace each other. They danced together, each playing to its strengths. That's why, even today, the most powerful speeches, the catchiest slogans, the bedtime stories we whisper to children, they all tap into that ancient magic, the human urge to turn wisdom into something that can be spoken, heard, and remembered. In societies where the spoken word was the only archive, storytellers became something far greater than mere performers. They were the pillars of civilization itself. Take the griots of West Africa, for example. These revered figures weren't just passing the time with tales around the fire. They were the keepers of royal lineages, the diplomats who remembered ancient treaties, the poets who preserved the victories and failures of kings. A griot's memory was so meticulously trained that they could recite generations of history without a single written record. Their words often accompanied by the hypnotic rhythms of the kora, a harp-like instrument that turned facts into melodies. To forget a detail wasn't just a mistake. It was a threat to the collective identity of an entire people. Across the sea, the Celtic bards of ancient Europe held similar power. Trained for years in rigorous oral academies, they mastered thousands of verses from epic battles to sacred laws. Their performances were theatrical events, blending song, poetry, and even prophecy. A bard's recitation wasn't passive listening. It was an immersive experience where the audience felt the clash of swords in alliterative verse or the grief of lost love in a haunting refrain. These techniques weren't artistic flourishes. They were memory devices, turning dry facts into emotional, sensor-rich experiences that stuck in the mind like burrs to clothe. But perhaps what's most striking is how these roles transcended mere preservation. In many cultures, storytellers were seen as bridges between worlds. The Native American tradition of the story knife, where elders would etch tales into the snow or mud while speaking, turned narratives into interactive lessons for children. In Tibet, Buddhist monks committed volumes of sacred texts to memory through melodic chants, believing the act of speaking them aloud carried spiritual power. Even in ancient India, the Vedas, some of humanity's oldest scriptures, were preserved with near-perfect accuracy for over 3,000 years through a system of call and response chanting so precise that a single mispronounced syllable would bring the recitation to a halt. This wasn't just about accuracy, it was about reverence. In societies without writing, a story wasn't property, It was a shared inheritance, and the storyteller was its temporary guardian. The Maori of New Zealand speak of whakapapa, the interlacing of genealogy and myth, where every recitation strengthens the bonds between past and present. When a Polynesian navigator chanted the names of stars to guide his canoe, he wasn't just recalling data, he was invoking ancestors who had sailed the same path centuries before. These traditions reveal something profound. Oral storytelling wasn't merely a method of storage, it was a way of weaving the living and the dead, the land and the people, into a single unbroken thread. And yet, for all their solemn duty, these storytellers knew the secret all great teachers understand. To make wisdom last, you must first make it unforgettable. That's why so many oral traditions brim with humor, suspense, or even shock. The same techniques modern filmmakers use to keep us glued to our seats. An Ashanti folktale might personify a cunning spider to teach ethics, while a Norse saga would exaggerate a hero's feats to stir ambition. The goal was never dry recitation, but to make the heart race, the fists clench, or the laughter erupt, because emotion is the hook that lodges knowledge deep in memory. What emerges is a portrait of these figures not as primitive relics, but as sophisticated intellectuals, the original professors, journalists, and librarians rolled into one. They prove that memory, when honed by necessity and enriched by artistry, can achieve feats that rival any hard drive. In an age where we forget passwords in seconds, their legacy challenges us. How much have we gained in convenience, and how much have we lost in depth? The answer might lie not in abandoning our tools, but in remembering what they first taught us, that the most enduring stories aren't just heard, but felt. The human mind is an incredible archive, but when tasked with preserving entire epics, genealogies, and laws across centuries without a single written word, our ancestors had to engineer ways to make memory fail-proof. They didn't just remember stories, they rebuilt them into structures so sturdy that even the passage of time couldn't erode them. Take the rhythmic heartbeat of poetry, for instance. When Homer's Iliad and Odyssey echoed through ancient Greek amphitheaters, their dactylic hexameter, a pattern of long and short syllables like the gallop of a horse, wasn't just artistic flair. It was a mnemonic engine, turning words into a rhythmic chant that muscles could feel and voices could ride. This wasn't unique to Greece. In India, Vedic priests perfected pathas, intricate recitation methods where verses were sung forward, backward, and even in alternating words to create a web of redundancy. One slip and the entire chain of chanters would halt, a self-correcting system older than the pyramids. But rhythm was only the beginning. Some cultures turned stories into physical objects you could hold. The Incas' quipu, a labyrinth of knotted chords, encoded narratives in colors, not positions, and textures, a tactile language that scholars still puzzle over today. In West Africa, the Akan people used adinkra, symbols carved into staffs or textiles, each pattern a visual trigger for proverbs and histories. Even children's games doubled as memory drills. Inuit elders taught survival skills through string figures, their fingers weaving tales of sea hunts into intricate shapes, while Aboriginal Australian message sticks carried news across tribes through notches and engravings. These weren't just aids, they were external hard drives in a world where paper didn't exist. Yet the most powerful tool was something far more primal: emotion. A Norse skald didn't just list a king's battles, he drowned his audience in the spray of icy waves, the scream of ravens over blood-stained snow. By weaponizing vivid imagery, storytellers hijacked the brain's natural bias toward emotional memory. The same trick lies in modern advertising: why we remember jingles but forget textbooks. And when words weren't enough, bodies became part of the script. Hawaiian hula dancers didn't just tell stories of volcanoes and gods. Their hands carved the narrative in the air, each gesture a syllable in a three-dimensional language. What's astonishing is how these techniques mirrored the brain's wiring long before neuroscience confirmed it. Studies now show that combining movement, melody, and narrative boosts recall by up to 70%, something the griots and bards knew instinctively. The Cherokee booger dance used masks and satire to cement social lessons, while Tibetan monks still memorize 1,000-page scriptures by mapping them to temple architecture, walking mentally through halls of text. Even today, memory champions use these ancient hacks like the method of loci, where information is placed along an imaginary path. The difference. Our ancestors didn't have the luxury of forgetting. The genius of oral tradition wasn't just preservation, it was flexibility. Unlike a stone tablet, a spoken story could adapt without breaking. Irish Sinchai storytellers tailored tales to their audiences, weaving in local landmarks or current events, while keeping the core myth intact. It's how the same epic might describe a hero sailing on the Great River in one village and the Mississippi centuries later. This fluidity let traditions evolve without erasing their essence, a lesson modern media moguls might envy. The real magic wasn't in the words themselves, but in the invisible architecture that made them stick, bend, and endure across millennia. Myths and folklore were never just stories. They were the ancient world's textbooks, moral compasses, and survival manuals all rolled into one. Consider the Norse tale of Ragnarök, where gods and monsters clash in an apocalyptic battle. On the surface, it's a gripping saga of fire and ice, but dig deeper, and it's a lesson in resilience. The prophecy doesn't end with destruction. It hints at rebirth, teaching listeners that even in despair, renewal is possible. This wasn't mere entertainment. It was psychological armor for a people facing harsh winters and uncertain futures. Across the ocean, the Navajo coyote stories played a similar role. Trickster tales might make children laugh at the antics of a mischievous animal, but woven between the humor were warnings about greed, arrogance, and the consequences of breaking social taboos. A single story could teach botany like which plants to avoid while also reinforcing community values. The brilliance lay in their layers. A child might remember the funny bits, but as they grew, the deeper truths would unfold like a map. Flexibility was key to these traditions. The Greek myth of Persephone's descent into the underworld, for example, wasn't set in stone. In one village, it might emphasize the changing seasons, while another might focus on a mother's grief, adapting to local needs without losing its core message about cycles of life and death. This fluidity let myths stay relevant across centuries, much like how modern franchises reinterpret classic tales to reflect contemporary struggles. What's striking is how these narratives tackled existential questions long before philosophy formalized them. The Maori creation story of Ranginui and Papatuanuku, the Sky Father and Earth Mother locked in an embrace, explained not just the origins of the world but the human yearning for connection. When their children separated them to let light in, it became a metaphor for growth requiring sacrifice, a truth that resonates whether you're in ancient Polynesia or a modern office. And let's not forget the practical genius of these tales. Before weather apps, the Kulin people of Australia read the sky through the adventures of Bunjil the eagle, whose wings carried storms. Inuit legends of Sedna, the sea goddess, encoded ocean currents and animal migration patterns within her tragic story. These weren't just explanations, they were data storage, turning survival skills into narratives too compelling to forget. The real power of myth, its ability to make the abstract visceral. The Hindu epic Mahabharata doesn't just list ethical dilemmas, it drags you onto the battlefield where Arjuna's anguish makes morality tangible. Compare that to a legal code and suddenly the stakes feel human. That's why these stories outlasted empires. They didn't just inform, they transformed. They turned listeners into participants, asking, "What would you do?" A question that echoes in every great story, from campfire tales to courtroom dramas. Today, we might call this world building or branding, but our ancestors knew it as something simpler, truth wrapped in wonder. When a Cherokee elder recounted how the Milky Way was spun by a spider, they weren't just describing stars. They were knitting the cosmos into everyday life, making the vast universe feel like home. That's the alchemy of folklore. It takes the chaos of existence and gives it shape, one unforgettable story at a time. Even the most sacred scriptures we now associate with leather-bound volumes and gilded pages began as living words carried on human breath. Long before the Hebrew Bible was painstakingly copied onto parchment, its psalms and prophecies echoed through the tents of nomadic tribes, each syllable preserved through generations of storytellers who treated memory as a sacred duty. The same is true for Hinduism's Vedas, a body of knowledge so vast that scholars estimate it would take over 70 hours just to recite them aloud. Yet for centuries, they existed solely in the minds of priests who trained from childhood to perfect every pitch-perfect syllable. What's extraordinary is how these traditions weaponized sound itself to guard against forgetfulness. The Quran's very name means recitation, and its verses were designed with cascading rhythms and internal rhymes that cling to the ear like song lyrics. Muslim Hafiz memorizers didn't just learn the text, they absorbed its musicality, turning chapters into melodies that could be checked against others like tuning forks. In Judaism, the Torah's trope symbols ancestors to musical notation, guided cantors enchanting scriptures with precise rises and falls, making deviations as jarring as a wrong piano key. These weren't aesthetic choices, they were fail-safes, acoustic fingerprints ensuring no word could be altered without detection. The training behind this feat bordered on the superhuman. In India, Vedic students spent a decade or more mastering Patha, a recursive system where texts were recited word by word, then backward, then with pairs swapped, a mental gymnastics routine that created redundant neural pathways. A single error meant starting over, a discipline so rigorous that when manuscripts finally appeared, some scholars rejected them as crutches. Meanwhile, in pre-Christian Ireland, Druids underwent 20-year apprenticeships, committing thousands of verses to memory because writing was considered inferior to the spoken word's spiritual potency. Yet oral scripture wasn't just about rote repetition, it was about embodiment. Tibetan Buddhist monks still debate whether a text truly exists if it hasn't been vocalized, their throaty churns of scripture believed to vibrate with the same energy as the original teachings. In West Africa, Yoruba divination verses are never merely spoken, they're performed with clapping, dancing, and call and response, turning cosmology into a communal symphony. This physicality anchored abstract ideas in muscle memory, proving that the body could be as reliable as any scroll. The paradox, many of these traditions feared writing would dilute their power. The Prophet Muhammad initially resisted having his revelations transcribed, wary of static words replacing living interpretation. Hindu gurus warned that scriptures read silently would lose their transformative shabda, the vibrational essence carried only by the human voice. And they weren't entirely wrong. When we read silently today, we miss what ancient cultures knew. That truth isn't just absorbed through the eyes, but through the resonance of breath and bone, the way a whispered prayer can feel heavier than a shout. Perhaps that's why these oral roots still surface in unexpected ways. A Torah scroll read aloud in synagogue, a gospel choir's call and response, the hypnotic drone of Buddhist sutras. They remind us that some words were never meant to lie flat on a page. They were born to be given weight and warmth by human voices, to travel not through ink, but through the one material that never truly fades, the endless, echoing chamber of memory. The shift from spoken word to written text wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, reluctant dance between two ways of knowing. When the first cuneiform marks were pressed into Mesopotamian clay around 3,200 years before the Common Era, they didn't erase oral tradition. They coexisted with it, like a new language struggling to translate the richness of the old. The ancient Greeks, famously wary of writing, believed letters would make minds lazy. Plato even warned that relying on texts would create forgetfulness in the soul, arguing that true wisdom lived only in dialogue, in the back and forth of voices where ideas could breathe and evolve. Yet writing had undeniable power. Imagine the awe of an Egyptian scribe watching hieroglyphs preserve a pharaoh's deeds forever, or a Chinese scholar carving oracle bones to fix prophecies in time. Where oral stories might shift with each teller's breath, writing promised something revolutionary, permanence. Laws could now stand unaltered across generations. Treaties could outlive the rulers who made them, and epics like Gilgamesh, once vulnerable to the frailties of human memory, could survive wars and plagues etched into clay. But this permanence came at a cost. The written word froze stories mid-flow, stripping away the gestures, the music, the communal energy that had once made them thrum with life. Some cultures fought to keep the old ways alive. In Ireland, Druids resisted Roman-style literacy for centuries, their oral schools preserving history in verse so precise that when Christian monks finally wrote it down, the texts retained the rhythmic pulse of spoken recitation. Indigenous Australian elders still teach songlines today, passing down navigation hymns that GPS can't replicate, while West African griots balance smartphones in one hand and choras in the other, proving that orality and technology aren't mutually exclusive. What's fascinating is how writing didn't replace oral tradition, it transformed it. Medieval scribes illuminated manuscripts with images that echoed the performative flair of bards, and Victorian parents read fairy tales aloud, unconsciously mimicking the call and response of ancient fireside. Even now, when we gather for audiobooks or podcasts, we're reaching back toward that primal urge to hear a human voice carrying meaning. The written word may have won the battle for dominance, but the heartbeat of oral tradition still thrums beneath every page turned, every story shared in the dark. Consider the Maori of New Zealand, whose ancestors navigated thousands of miles across the Pacific by memorizing the stars, currents, and winds, knowledge preserved not in logbooks but in chants passed down through generations. When European settlers arrived with their written laws and deeds, they dismissed these oral traditions as primitive. Yet today, Maori, Whakapapa genealogies are recognized in New Zealand courts as legal evidence of land rights, proving that a spoken lineage can carry the same weight as penned parchment. This isn't just survival, it's resilience, a defiant whisper outlasting the roar of history. In the Arctic, Inuit elders teach children to read ice and wind through throat singing and storytelling, turning survival skills into rhythmic duets where breaths sync like Morse code. During the Canadian government's forced assimilation era, when Indigenous languages were banned in schools, these songs became covert classrooms. Elders would recount tales of Sedna, the sea goddess, her fingers becoming seals and whales, a disguised lesson in marine biology and ecology. Now, throat singing has surged back, with teens posting TikTok duets that blend ancient techniques with modern beats, proving tradition doesn't fossilize, it evolves. Australia's Aboriginal communities face perhaps the most staggering legacy: 65,000 years of unbroken oral history, now battling extinction. But here's the twist: technology has become an unlikely ally. In Arnhem Land, elders used digital animation to bring Dreamtime stories to screens, while message sticks, once carved from wood, now appear as emoji-filled texts between teens. The Yolngu people even developed an AI chatbot trained on elder interviews, ensuring future generations can still ask, "What did the rainbow serpent teach us?" and hear the answer in their ancestors' voices. What makes these traditions unshakable isn't just their content but their adaptability. The Navajo Nation, for instance, now broadcasts radio shows in Diné Bizod, weaving pandemic safety tips into coyote tales. In Hawaii, hula schools teach both traditional chants and Instagram reels, where hip-swaying dancers tag #protect Mauna Kea alongside videos of lava flows. These aren't compromises, they're revolutions, proof that oral tradition thrives not by rejecting change but by absorbing it, like rivers carving new paths through bedrock. The real lesson: these stories refuse to be archived as relics. When a Maori carver chisels a meeting house post, each spiral encodes a migration saga meant to be recited aloud, not just admired in silence. When Inuit hunters teach sons to build igloos, they don't hand them manuals, they sing the steps into memory. These cultures remind us that some knowledge can't be frozen in ink. It must live in lungs and hands, in the space between speaker and listener where meaning sparks. In an age drowning in data but starved for wisdom, perhaps we're finally ready to listen. The Epic of Gilgamesh didn't start as a relic in a museum. It was once alive in the voices of Mesopotamian storytellers, spinning tales of a king's arrogance and a wild man's wisdom around fires that flickered against the night. Long before scribes pressed its verses into clay, this story lived in the breath and rhythm of performers who knew its beats by heart, its lines shaped by generations of retelling. What's astonishing isn't just its age, nearly 4,000 years, but how its journey from spoken word to written tablet reveals the alchemy of oral tradition. The earliest fragments we've found aren't rigid scripts, they're variations like jazz renditions of a melody, each version adapting to its audience while keeping the core intact. At its heart, Gilgamesh is a story about the things that haunt us all: the fear of death, the ache of loss, the hunger for legacy. When the hero weeps over his friend Enkidu, his grief isn't locked in ancient cuneiform, it's raw, immediate, the kind of emotion that would have gripped listeners as tightly then as it does readers now. That's the magic of oral tradition. It didn't just preserve plot points, it amplified the human pulse beneath them. The repetitive refrains, "Gilgamesh, where are you wandering?" weren't poetic flourishes. They were hooks for memory, rhythmic anchors that let storytellers reconstruct the epic's vast arc without a single note. Yet the real turning point came when scribes began etching these words onto clay. Suddenly, a tale that had once bent with each teller's voice became fixed, its metaphors fossilized. But here's the twist: writing didn't sterilize Gilgamesh, it gave it immortality. The library of Ashurbanipal, where the most complete version was found, wasn't just a storage room, it was a time capsule, proving that oral tradition's greatest gift was its ability to seed stories durable enough to survive their own transformation. What's mesmerizing is how modern this ancient epic feels. Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life mirrors our own obsession with cheating death, whether through medicine or digital footprints. His bond with Enkidu echoes bromances in today's blockbusters, while the flood narrative, yes, it predates the Bible's version, shows how oral traditions weave through cultures like underground rivers. The epic's flexibility before writing is what made it universal. Its fixity afterward is what let it cross oceans of time, and perhaps that's the lesson. Oral tradition wasn't a placeholder for writing, it was a laboratory, where stories were stress-tested by countless voices until only the most resilient survived. Gilgamesh endures not despite its oral roots, but because of them. Every time we retell it, we're not just reading a text, we're joining a chain of whispers stretching back to the dawn of civilization, proving that some stories are too vital to ever really be finished. Homer's epics didn't spring fully formed from a single genius's mind. They were the product of centuries of refinement, a collaborative tapestry woven by countless bards before him. Picture a dimly lit hall in ancient Greece where a poet stands with a lyre, his voice rising and falling in dactylic hexameter as he spins the tale of Achilles' rage. But here's the twist: no two performances were ever the same. Like a jazz musician riffing on a classic melody, Homer, or the generations of singers who came before him, relied on a mental toolkit of formulaic phrases, stock scenes, and rhythmic patterns to reconstruct the Iliad and Odyssey anew each time. The epithets we now see as poetic flourishes, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, were actually mnemonic stepping stones, placeholders that gave the bard breathing room to improvise while keeping the story's spine intact. This wasn't rote recitation, it was high-wire storytelling. Scholars call it the oral formulaic technique, where up to 90% of the verses were built from reusable blocks of language. Imagine assembling a mosaic where each tile could slot into multiple scenes: a hero's arming sequence, a ship's launch, a god's intervention. These prefabricated chunks let bards focus their mental energy on the story's emotional peaks: Hector's farewell to Andromache, Odysseus weeping at the song of his own deeds, while the formulas carried the connective tissue. The result: epics that could stretch for hours without a single written cue, yet still feel fresh to audiences who'd heard them a dozen times before. What's often overlooked is how this system nurtured creativity within constraints. The fixed meter and stock phrases weren't cages, they were springboards. A skilled bard could tweak a single word to shift a scene's tone, or rearrange episodes to suit his audience, emphasizing Odysseus' cunning for a crowd of merchants, his bravery for warriors. Even the inconsistencies modern readers spot, like two contradictory accounts of Odysseus' scar, aren't mistakes but fingerprints of oral composition, traces of different performers' choices preserved when the epics were finally written down. The real marvel is how these techniques mirrored the brain's wiring. Cognitive science now shows that chunking information into patterns like those formulaic lines boosts recall by up to 40%. The rhythm of dactylic hexameter, with its galloping, dum-da-da beats, likely synced with the performer's breathing, turning physiology into a memory aid. And the epithets, they acted like neural bookmarks, triggering cascades of associated verses. This wasn't primitive storytelling, it was neuroscience avant la lettre, a system refined through trial and error over generations until it became as reliable as ink. Yet for all its precision, the tradition was never static. When archaeologists compared the earliest written fragments of Homer to later versions, they found subtle shifts, proof that even after transcription, the epics kept evolving in performance. That fluidity hints at something profound. These stories weren't meant to be frozen. They were living things, as changeable as the wine-dark sea they described, adapting to new shores while keeping their depths intact. When we read Homer today, we're not just encountering a text, we're hearing the ghostly echo of 1,000 voices, each adding their breath to the song. In the heart of West Africa, where the Sahel meets the savannah, the griot stands as a living archive, a vessel for histories too vital to be entrusted to parchment alone. These master storytellers aren't mere performers. They're the beating heart of communities, the keepers of names that stretch back centuries, the diplomats who remember every treaty, every alliance, every betrayal. To become a griot isn't simply to learn a craft, it's to inherit a sacred covenant between the living and the dead. From childhood, apprentices are immersed in a sonic universe, their ears trained to detect the slightest deviation in a family's genealogy, their voices molded to carry the weight of kingdoms in a single phrase. The Griot's toolkit is a marvel of oral engineering. Take the kora, a 21-string harp whose shimmering notes aren't just accompaniment but mnemonic triggers. Each pluck of its strings corresponds to a lineage, a battle, a proverb, turning music into a three-dimensional map of memory. When a griot sings of Sundiata Keita, the 13th century founder of the Mali Empire, the melody itself becomes a timestamp, distinguishing this Sundiata from 100 others in the chronicles. And then there's the taraku, the griot's signature rapid-fire delivery, a cascade of names and events so precisely timed that altering a single syllable would unravel the thread of history. What's often misunderstood is the griot's role as both preserver and provocateur. In man culture, they're known as Nyamakalaw, a caste apart, granted license to speak uncomfortable truths even to kings. A griot might praise a ruler's ancestors in one breath, then remind them of a broken promise in the next, all wrapped in metaphorical wit so sharp it draws blood without leaving a mark. This duality, reverence and critique, keeps the tradition alive, ensuring it's never reduced to nostalgia. Today, this ancient practice defies modern assumptions. In downtown Bamako, griots like Basaku Kouete fuse kora riffs with electric guitars, their lyrics scrolling through smartphones while still honoring centuries-old verses. Senegalese hip-hop artists sample griot chants in their beats, transforming ancestral wisdom into protest anthems. Even diaspora communities from Brooklyn to Paris host griot nights, where elders and teens trade stories over thumping bass lines, proving memory doesn't fossilize, it remixes. The griot's endurance reveals a radical truth. Oral tradition isn't about clinging to the past, it's about weaponizing the past to navigate the present. When a griot recounts the 1898 Battle of Tabankortu, they're not just describing spears and shields, they're dissecting the anatomy of resistance, offering a blueprint for today's struggles. In a world drowning in data but starving for meaning, the griot reminds us that some truths are too potent to be confined to paper. They must be lived, breathed, and above all heard. For thousands of years before European settlers arrived with quills and parchment, the indigenous peoples of North America were perfecting a different kind of historical record, one woven from breath, rhythm, and collective memory. Take the Navajo creation story, the Dene Bahane adjective, which recounts the journey through four worlds not as a fixed scripture but as a living narrative, shifting slightly with each telling to reflect the listener's age or the season's lessons. When an elder describes the emergence of first man and first woman from a reed-filled underworld, they're not just recounting myth, they're encoding geological events, migration routes, and ethical codes into a single resonant tale. The same story might explain why certain plants heal, how to read the desert's shifting sands, or why reciprocity governs relationships, all without a single written word. The Iroquois Confederacy's founding narrative offers another masterclass in oral precision. The Great Law of Peace, which united 5 warring nations under the guidance of the peacemaker, was memorized down to the last wampum belt symbolism. Every metaphor, like the uprooted tree that symbolized burying past conflicts, served dual purposes, as poetic imagery and as legal precedent. When European colonists arrived, they were stunned to find a democratic system more sophisticated than many in Europe, its constitution preserved entirely through spoken recitations at Grand Council fires. These weren't folktales, they were the blueprints of governance, with each clause's rhythm acting as a mnemonic safeguard against alteration. What unsettles traditional historians is how these oral accounts often append Eurocentric timelines. The Zuni people's chronicles of Spanish contact, passed down through ceremonial dramas, describe conquistadors not as heroic explorers but as starving men saved by Pueblo farmers, a perspective absent from most textbooks. The Lakota winter counts, pictographic calendars kept on buffalo hides, mark events like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty with nuances lost in written documents, revealing how officials manipulated translations to seize land. Even environmental knowledge defies Western assumptions. When Tlingit elders speak of glaciers retreating, like a bear waking from winter, their descriptions align perfectly with modern climate data, preserved through metaphors that made the patterns unforgettable. The urgency to preserve these traditions today isn't just about cultural respect, it's about correcting historical blind spots. When the Hopi speak of their migrations across the Southwest, their stories reference landmarks that archaeologists now confirm as ancient trade routes. Passamaquoddy canoe songs contain tidal patterns that still guide fishermen along the Maine coast. Yet this wisdom hangs by a thread. Of the 300 indigenous languages once spoken north of Mexico, over half have vanished, taking with them irreplaceable ways of seeing the world. Nowhere is the resilience of oral tradition more striking than in its modern adaptations. The Navajo Nation now broadcasts weather alerts in Diné Bizard, blending storm warnings with teachings from the hero twins about respecting nature's power. In British Columbia, Tsimshian youth produce rap albums that sample elders' potlatch chants, turning ancestral laws into viral hooks. These aren't breaks from tradition, they're continuations, proving that the human voice remains the most durable archive. After all, parchment crumbles and hard drives fail, but a story breathed into the next generation's memory that can outlast empires. Deep in the oak groves of ancient Britain and Ireland, the Celtic bard wasn't just a performer. They were a one-person institution, a walking library whose voice could make kings or break them. To earn the title of Olam, the highest bardic rank, required 12 years of grueling study, memorizing over 350 tales categorized by theme: cattle raids, voyages, love tragedies, and battles. But these weren't mere stories. They were the legal precedents, moral codes, and historical records of Celtic society, all wrapped in intricate verse designed to survive centuries without a single written word. The bard's training was a feat of mental discipline that would humble modern memory champions. Students learned through the oral literal method, where every syllable, every alliterative phrase was drilled until it became muscle memory. Complex meters like Don Diarach enforced strict patterns of rhyme and rhythm, acting as error-correcting codes stray from the structure, and the verse would collapse like a misbuilt arch. A bard's recitation of a king's lineage wasn't just a list of names. It was a cascading chant where each generation's deeds interlaced like knotwork, the very sound reinforcing authenticity. Their power extended far beyond entertainment. A bard's satire could literally ruin a ruler. The legendary glamdisin, a form of poetic cursing, was feared as a weapon. When the Welsh bard Taliesin mocked King Maelgwn's tyranny, his verses were said to summon plagues. Conversely, a well-crafted praise poem could cement a chieftain's legitimacy, turning ambition into legacy. This wasn't hyperbole. Irish Brehon laws explicitly ranked bards alongside judges and physicians, their words holding legal weight in disputes over land or succession. The English conquest of Ireland targeted this tradition with brutal precision. Statutes like the 16th century Act for the English Order, Habit, and Language banned bardic schools, seeing them as seedbeds of rebellion. Manuscripts were burned, harps destroyed, and bards exiled. Yet the tradition refused to die. In hidden, hedge schools, masters whispered verses to students by firelight. The Irish language itself became a vessel for resistance. with poets like Egan O'Rahilly penning covert elegies for fallen Gaelic lords, their metaphors thick with double meanings to evade censors. Even in decline, the Bardic legacy reshaped the world. The Welsh Eisteddfod, a revival of ancient Bardic competitions, became a cornerstone of cultural survival. James Macpherson's controversial Ossian poems, though later exposed as partly fabricated, ignited Europe's Romantic movement by tapping into hunger for Celtic oral epics. Today, when a Breton singer performs gwers, ballads, or a Scottish storyteller recounts the Fionn cycle, they're not reviving a dead tradition. They're proving that some voices are too resilient to be silenced by ink or empire. The bards knew a secret we're only now rediscovering: memory, when woven into art, becomes immortal. Music didn't just accompany oral traditions, it supercharged them, transforming stories from fleeting words into unforgettable experiences. Think of the Viking skalds, their voices rising and falling in complex skaldic meter, each syllable locked into place by alliteration and rhyme like pieces of a puzzle. These weren't just poems, they were memory palaces set to rhythm, where the clashing of consonants mimicked the clash of swords, making the sagas of Ragnar Lothbrok or the deeds of Odin as sticky as a modern pop song's chorus. The same technique echoed in West Africa, where griots spun genealogies into melodies, their chorus humming with the names of ancestors, turning dry lineages into something you could dance to. But rhythm was only half the magic. Instruments added layers of meaning that words alone couldn't convey. In ancient Greece, the lyre's strings underscored the melancholy of Orpheus's lament, while in the Andes, the panpipe's breathy notes became the voice of mountains and rivers in Quechua legends. The Cherokee used river cane flutes to mimic animal calls in their origin stories, blurring the line between music and mimicry. Even the drone of a Tibetan chant wasn't just background noise, it was a vibrational bridge to the divine, each harmonic overtone representing a different plane of existence. This multisensory approach wasn't accidental. It was neuroscience before the term existed. Studies now show that pairing information with melody activates multiple brain regions at once, creating a web of associations that make recall effortless. That's why children can sing the alphabet before they can recite it, and why Homer's epis survived centuries without a scribe's pen. The beat of an Irish bodhrán drum didn't just keep time for a bard's tale, it synced listeners' heartbeats to the story's pulse, forging an emotional connection no parchment could replicate. The real genius lay in how these traditions tailored music to their needs. Australian Aboriginal songlines used rhythmic patterns to encode thousands of miles of geography, while enslaved Africans in the Americas transformed work songs into covert maps to freedom, hiding directions in the spaces between notes. In the Scottish Highlands, the puirt a buail, or mouth music, replaced forbidden bagpipes with vocal imitations, keeping cultural memory alive under English oppression. Music wasn't decoration, it was resistance, navigation, and survival, all wrapped in a melody. Today, we still feel the echoes of this ancient synergy. From hip-hop's storytelling cadences to the haunting leitmotifs of film scores, we're drawn to narratives that don't just speak but sing. The next time you find yourself humming an ad jingle from childhood, remember, you're tapping into a primal technology, one that our ancestors perfected to ensure their stories would outlast the rise and fall of empires. The notes may have changed, but the purpose remains the same: to make the unforgettable impossible to forget. Proverbs and riddles were the Swiss Army knives of oral tradition, compact, versatile, and razor-sharp in their ability to slice through complexity. Imagine an Ashanti grandmother in Ghana teaching her granddaughter about patience, not with a lecture, but with the proverb, "The ripe fruit falls quietly," or a Maori elder in New Zealand warning against greed by asking, "What good is a cloak of feathers if it blinds you to the sky?" These weren't just clever turns of phrase, they were survival tools, honed over generations to package life's hardest lessons into packages small enough to carry, yet durable enough to last centuries. Take the fables we now associate with Aesop, the tortoise and the hare, the boy who cried wolf. Long before they were inked onto papyrus, these stories traveled on the tongues of enslaved people in ancient Greece, their animal characters serving as safe vessels to critique power. Aesop himself, if he existed at all, was likely just one link in a chain of storytellers who knew that wrapping truth in fur and feathers made it harder for tyrants to spot. The same strategy thrived in Africa with Anansi the spider tales, where a trickster's antics covertly taught resistance, and in the American South, where Biara rabbit stories became coded survival guides for the enslaved. Riddles elevated this art of compression even further. In Old English tradition, a riddle like, "I saw a woman standing alone, her dress fluttering in the wind," answer, "A ship's sail," wasn't just wordplay, it trained minds to see the world metaphorically, a skill vital for interpreting omens or decoding nature's signs. The Norse used riddles in ritual contests called flyting, where warriors traded poetic barbs to prove their wit was as sharp as their swords. Even today, the Sami people of Scandinavia preserve reindeer herding knowledge through riddles that describe ice formations or animal behavior in cryptic verse, ensuring only those deeply immersed in their culture can unlock the answers. What's startling is how these miniature narratives mirror modern brain science. Proverbs and riddles leverage what cognitive scientists call a chunking, breaking information into bite-sized, pattern-rich units that our minds cling to like Velcro. The rhythmic parallelism of easy come, easy go, or the paradoxical twist of the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth, makes them stick where longer sermons fade. Cultures from China to Cherokee embedded these nuggets in daily speech until they became reflexes, ready to surface when a child lied or a hunter grew overconfident. Yet for all their simplicity, these forms were anything but simplistic. The Yoruba proverb, "Until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter," carries as much political heft as any manifesto. The Inuit saying, "A long night can teach you more than 1,000 days," distills Arctic resilience into 11 words. Even now, when we say, "Don't count your chickens before they hatch," we're not just quoting a farmyard warning, we're invoking a 2,000-year-old chain of oral wisdom, proof that some truths are too vital to be left unrhymed. Perhaps that's why these fragments outlasted the civilizations that birthed them. The Zulu proverb, "A single stick may smoke, but it won't make a fire," still fuels teamwork seminars today, while Texio's repurposed Lao-Tzu's ooze, "Give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day," to sell coding boot camps. The packaging changes, but the payload endures. In an age drowning in information but starving for wisdom, we're rediscovering what oral cultures knew all along. The shortest path to the human mind isn't through the eye, but through the ear, and the quicker it rhymes, the longer it lingers. A young girl flees a cruel stepmother, leaving behind a slipper that changes her destiny. Sound familiar? The story echoes from China's Yi Zion in the 9th century to the French Cendrillon, from the Egyptian Rhodopes to the Korean Kongjue and Patjue. These aren't coincidences, they're evidence of a storytelling web that spanned continents long before the internet. What's mesmerizing isn't just the shared plot, the persecuted heroine, the lost footwear, the royal recognition, but how each culture wove the tale to fit its world. In the Vietnamese version, T letter 1A5M com, the slipper becomes a golden shoe, and the fairy godmother transforms into a magical fish from the heroine's dead mother. The Algonquin First Nations tell of an orphan girl aided by a grandmother figure in the moon. These variations aren't distortions, they're cultural translations, proving that oral tradition never merely copied, it reinvented. Trickster figures reveal even more about this global conversation. West Africa's Anansi the spider, with his cunning and chaotic creativity, shares DNA with Scandinavia's Loki, Japan's kitsune foxes, and the Lakota Sua's Iktomi. Each reflects societal values through mischief. Anansi outwits predators to teach the oppressed resourcefulness, while Coyote in Navajo tales often fails spectacularly, illustrating the consequences of arrogance. The Cherokee even have a saying, "When Coyote howls, he's not laughing, he's remembering the last time he thought he was clever." These characters weren't just entertainment, they were moral compasses disguised as chaos. Their stories carried along trade routes like spices and silk. The mechanics of this cultural cross-pollination are astonishing. Consider the animal bride motif, a human marrying a creature who later reveals divine origins. In Scotland, it's a selkie shedding her sealskin. In Nigeria, it's Mami Wata, the water spirit. Indigenous Australian tales speak of the rainbow serpent's transformative powers. Scholars trace these threads to ancient contact points: the Indian Ocean trade, the Silk Road, even the Bering Land Bridge. A story told in a Mongolian yurt might resurface centuries later in a Norse longhouse, reshaped by climate, religion, or social structure. The Zulu Athlakaniana, a tiny, voracious trickster, mirrors the German Till Eulenspiegel, suggesting stories leapfrogged across empires through enslaved people, merchants, or wandering minstrels. What binds these tales isn't just plot, it's the raw human needs they address. The kindness rewarded, cruelty punished theme in Cinderella variants reassured children in harsh worlds that justice could prevail. Trickster tales gave the powerless psychological armor, teaching that brains often trump brawn. Even the gruesome warnings in stories like Germany's The Juniper Tree or China's The Tiger Grandmother served as prehistoric safety manuals, coding stranger danger into narrative. The Finnish Kelvola and the Maya Popol Vuh both feature cosmic battles over creation, revealing how cultures grappled with the same existential questions through story. Modern research confirms what oral traditions knew instinctively. Linguists find that folktales preserve archaic language patterns, like fossils in sedimentary rock. Anthropologists map migration routes through story divergences. The farther populations drifted, the more their tales mutated, like genetic drift. And psychologists note that children exposed to multicultural variants of the same tale develop stronger cognitive flexibility, learning early that there's never just one version of truth. Perhaps that's the real magic of these global echoes. They remind us that beneath the surface differences of skin, language, or creed, humans have always been storytelling animals, spinning the same fundamental fears and hopes into infinite forms. A bedtime story in Babylon isn't so different from one in Buenos Aires. Both are made of the same stuff, the universal longing to make sense of life, once upon a time at a time. Colonialism didn't just redraw maps, it tried to erase memories. When European powers swept across continents, they didn't merely seize land, they targeted the very stories that bound communities together. Missionaries in Canada burned indigenous ceremonial masks, dismissing them as pagan relics. British administrators in Australia banned Aboriginal children from speaking their languages, severing the thread of songlines that had guided their people for millennia. In Africa, colonial schools punished students for recounting griot tales, labeling them backward fables. The message was clear: your history doesn't count unless it's written in our script, archived in our libraries. Yet beneath this systematic suppression, oral traditions found ways to survive, sometimes in plain sight. Enslaved Africans in the Americas transformed forbidden drumming into rhythmic handclaps and foot stomps, embedding Yoruba orations into work songs and spirituals. The Navajo, forbidden from performing their sacred chants, wove them into seemingly innocuous weaving patterns, where only initiates could decipher the stories threaded between the wool. In Ireland, hedge schoolmasters taught Gaelic poetry disguised as harmless folk tunes, their meters preserving rebel codes against English rule. These weren't just acts of preservation, they were acts of defiance, proving that a story whispered could outlast a law shouted. The damage, however, was profound. The Tlingit of Alaska lost entire clans' histories when smallpox wiped out their elders, the living libraries of their people. The Maori Whakapapa genealogies fractured as colonial courts demanded written deeds instead of spoken lineages. Even when stories survived, they often became fragments, like a puzzle with half its pieces scattered. A Cherokee elder might recall the beginning of the Corn Mother myth, but forget the harvest prayer that once followed it, leaving gaps no textbook could fill. Today, the race to reclaim these voices is as urgent as it is inspiring. Linguists partner with Lakota elders to transcribe winter counts before the last fluent speakers pass away. In New Zealand, digital platforms like the Te Aka Maori Dictionary crowdsource lost words from community memories. Perhaps most moving are the language nests in Hawaii, where toddlers now learn Alilo Hawaii through chants that were nearly silenced a generation ago. These efforts aren't about nostalgia, they're about justice. When the last surviving speaker of the Yuchai language, Marie Smith Jones, died in 2008, she left behind a rallying cry. A language isn't just words, it's a heartbeat. What colonialism couldn't anticipate was the adaptability of oral cultures. In Greenland, Inuit poets rapped traditional throat-singing rhythms over hip-hop beats to teach climate activism. The Sami of Scandinavia use YouTube to share joik songs that Norwegian schools once banned. Even the humble hashtag has become a modern-day wampum belt, with movements like #idle, no more spreading indigenous stories globally in seconds. The resilience of these traditions forces a reckoning. The primitive oral cultures colonial powers tried to eradicate were never fragile. They were fluid, designed to outlast empires. This dark chapter holds a mirror to our own era. As we digitize ancient stories, we face new questions. Can a database capture the tremor in a griot's voice as she recounts her ancestors' deeds? Does a transcribed legend retain its power without the scent of sage in the air? The answers lie in the living. When a Maori carver teaches his grandson to recite their lineage while chiseling a meeting house post, or when a Cherokee storyteller streams a fireside tale to thousands, they're doing what their ancestors did, adapting the vessel, but keeping the essence alive. The colonial assault on oral tradition wasn't just an attack on the past, it was an attempt to silence futures. And as these voices rise again, they prove one immutable truth: some stories refuse to stay buried. The hum of a podcast microphone, the crackle of a live storytelling event, the glow of a smartphone screen streaming an elder's tale, these are the new campfires. Far from fading into obsolescence, oral storytelling is surging back with a vitality that would make ancient bards nod in recognition. Take The Moth, where everyday people stand under spotlights to share unscripted, deeply personal stories. The format is sleekly modern, but the essence is primal: a voice, an audience, and the electric charge of a narrative unfolding in real time. It's no accident that these events often feel like secular church services. They tap into the same communal magic that once held villages wrapped around a fire. Even Teardy talks with their 18-minute precision. owe a debt to oral tradition, distilling complex ideas into narratives designed to stick in the mind long after the applause fades. What's most striking is how indigenous storytellers are leading this revival, wielding technology not as a threat but as a tool. In British Columbia, the S letter 1A3, 5WX symbol 33, 1W acute 7 mesh Uxwumix was Squamish Nation shares creation stories through animated YouTube shorts, the same tales once whispered in longhouses now reaching millions with a click. Maori podcasters in New Zealand blend ancestral legends with contemporary issues, proving that the story of Maui fishing up islands has just as much to say about climate change today as it did about cosmology centuries ago. These aren't compromises, they're continuations, showing how oral tradition thrives not by resisting change but by absorbing it, just as it always has. The digital age has even birthed new hybrids of orality and literacy. Audiobooks let us read with our ears, returning to the ancient pleasure of being carried by a narrator's voice. Apps like StoryCorps archive oral histories with the reverence once reserved for sacred texts, while platforms like TikTok see Gen Z crafting micro-sagas in 60-second videos, their rapid cuts mirroring the rhythmic pacing of griots or scalds. Even the resurgence of live comedy specials taps into this hunger for unfiltered human connection, the kind that only happens when words are breathed into a room rather than pixelated on a screen. Yet the heart of this revival isn't about nostalgia, it's about necessity. In an era of algorithm-driven isolation, the simple act of sharing stories face-to-face or screen-to-screen counters the loneliness of digital life. Psychology backs this up. Studies show that hearing a story activates more brain regions than reading it, lighting up neural pathways linked to empathy and memory. No wonder corporate trainers now use storytelling techniques borrowed from indigenous elders, or that therapists prescribe narrative exercises to heal trauma. The oldest form of communication, it turns out, might be the most futuristic. This isn't just a revival, it's a rebellion. Against the flattening forces of globalization, oral tradition insists on the particular, the local, the irreducibly human. When a Sahrawi poet in Western Sahara films a spoken-word piece about displacement on a smartphone, or when a Navajo grandmother records her flock of sheep with a drone to teach grazing practices, they're doing more than preserving culture. They're proving that the voice, frail, fleeting, and profoundly resilient, remains the ultimate technology, one that no empire, no algorithm, no amount of time can ever fully silence. Oral tradition didn't fade with the rise of smartphones. It evolved, finding new life in the very technologies that were supposed to replace it. Think about the last time you scrolled through TikTok and stumbled on a 60-second story so gripping you couldn't look away. That's not just content, it's the digital descendant of a griot's performance or a bard's recitation, compressed for a swipe-happy audience but still tapping into the same primal urge to connect through narrative. Platforms like YouTube and Instagram have become the new village squares, where storytellers don't need a royal court or a campfire, just a camera and an internet connection. The comment sections buzz with reactions, emulating the call and response rhythms of ancient oral cultures, where listeners weren't passive but active participants, shaping the tale as it unfolded. Even audiobooks, with their intimate narration, resurrect the lost art of listening. When a voice actor breathes life into a character, they're channeling the same techniques Celtic bards used to differentiate heroes from villains through tone and cadence. Companies like Audible have turned this into a billion-dollar industry, proving that there's still something irreplaceable about hearing a story rather than reading it. Podcasts take it further, blending storytelling with conversation, much like indigenous elders weaving lessons into casual dialogue. Shows like This American Life or The Moth don't just inform, they immerse, using pacing and pauses to create suspense, just as a Maori storyteller might lower their voice to draw listeners closer. But this digital renaissance isn't without its shadows. The same tools that amplify voices can also distort them. Misinformation spreads like wildfire online, echoing the challenges preliterate societies faced when oral histories were manipulated by power. A griot's reputation hinged on their accuracy. Today, viral stories often prioritize clicks over truth. Yet, there's hope in the way some communities are reclaiming authenticity. Indigenous TikTokers, for example, use the platform to correct stereotypes, sharing traditional stories with captions like, "This isn't a myth, it's our history." The oral tradition's emphasis on accountability, where a storyteller's credibility was tied to their community's trust, finds new expression in verified creators and fact-checking algorithms. What's truly remarkable is how these digital adaptations reveal the resilience of oral storytelling's core principles. The best YouTube creators don't just recite scripts, they perform, using visuals, music, and audience interaction to create multisensory experiences akin to a hula dancer's chant or a skald's epic. Live streams bring back the spontaneity of ancient performances, where the audience's reactions could steer the narrative. Even hashtags function like modern-day mnemonics, organizing collective memory just as recurring refrains did in Homer's epics. The mediums have changed, but the mission remains the same: to make stories stick, to bind people together, and to ensure the most vital truths outlast the noise. This isn't just progress, it's a homecoming. For all our gigabytes and fiber optic cables, we're rediscovering what oral cultures never forgot: that the human voice, with all its warmth and imperfection, is still the most powerful technology we've ever invented. The next time you lose yourself in a podcast or share a meme that tells a story, remember, you're not just consuming content, you're keeping alive a tradition that has survived, adapted, and thrived for 65,000 years. And that's a story worth passing on. The human brain didn't evolve to memorize dry lists or static facts. It craves rhythm, pattern, and meaning. That's why oral traditions didn't just survive for millennia. They thrived, leveraging cognitive shortcuts our minds are hardwired to follow. Take rhyme, for example. When a West African griot sings, the spider's web is weak alone but strong when threads are intertwined. The pairing of alone and intertwined isn't just poetic. It's neurological Velcro. Studies show rhyming phrases activate the brain's auditory cortex and hippocampus simultaneously, creating dual pathways for recall. This same principle lives in modern advertising jingles, proof that our ancestors were cognitive scientists long before the field had a name. Rhythm works similarly, tapping into the brain's love for predictability. The steady cadence of Homeric hexameter or the pulse of a Navajo night chant acts like a metronome for memory, syncing neural activity to the story's beat. Functional MRI scans reveal that rhythmic speech increases activity in the basal ganglia, a region linked to procedural learning, the same system that helps you ride a bike without thinking. No wonder epic poems like Beowulf could span thousands of lines without a single written cue. The rhythm wasn't decoration, it was scaffolding, holding the narrative together even when details shifted with each retelling. Then there's repetition, oral tradition's secret weapon. The Cherokee Trail of Tears laments sung for generations repeat key phrases like, "We are marching to the west," not out of creative lack but by design. Cognitive psychologists call this the spacing effect. Information revisited at intervals embeds deeper into long-term memory. Indigenous Australian songlines take this further. weaving critical navigation cues into refrains sung at specific landmarks, effectively geotagging knowledge to physical spaces. It's a living GPS where the song's repetition ensures survival, but perhaps the most dazzling mental hack is the method of loci, an ancient technique still used by memory champions today. Greek orators visualized speeches as rooms in a familiar house, placing each argument by the door, the hearth, the bed. Similarly, Polynesian navigators memorized star paths by associating them with body parts. The knee of the constellation points to Tahiti. Modern experiments confirm this works because it hijacks the brain's spatial memory, which is far more robust than abstract recall. When Tibetan monks memorize 1,000-page scriptures by mentally walking through temple architecture, they're using the same neural real estate that helps you remember where you left your keys. What's revelatory is how these methods exploit the brain's quirks. Emotionally charged stories, like the Norse tale of Baldur's death, drenched in grief trigger the amygdala, cementing details alongside visceral feelings. Vivid imagery, such as the Maori description of the Skyfather's tears becoming rain, lights up the visual cortex, creating mental pictures harder to erase than plain facts. Even humor plays a role. Anansi the spider's mishaps in African folklore leverage surprise, jolting the brain's novelty-seeking dopamine system. These techniques weren't stumbled upon by accident. They were refined through trial and error across generations, a slow-motion science experiment where survival depended on perfect recall. When a Lakota elder recounts the Star Boy legend, the constellation's positions aren't just plot points, they're celestial mnemonics, tested and preserved because those who remembered them thrived. Oral tradition wasn't pre-scientific, it was the original applied neuroscience, a mastery of memory's mechanics that continues to whisper to us through the ages. Every time we teach a child with a rhyming game or navigate a city by landmarks, we're unknowingly paying homage to this ancient cognitive artistry. Long before gavels struck courtrooms or legal tomes lined shelves, justice lived in the voices of elders and the rhythms of recited codes. Picture an open-air assembly in medieval Ireland, where Brehon judges trained for decades in intricate oral statutes, settled disputes by summoning precedents from memory with the precision of a librarian retrieving scrolls. Their rulings on cattle raids, land boundaries, or marital conflicts weren't arbitrary. They drew from a vast mental archive of legal poetry, where every alliterative verse served as both ruling and mnemonic device. A single case might reference ancestral judgments stretching back centuries, preserved not in ink but in the cadence of call and response between masters and apprentices. This wasn't primitive jurisprudence, it was a highly adaptive system. Norse thing assemblies operated similarly, with law speakers reciting entire legal codes at annual gatherings, their voices carrying across fjords to affirm communal norms. The Viking griots, a compilation of Icelandic law, existed purely in oral form for generations, its clauses structured around kenning's poetic metaphors that acted as mental bookmarks. A phrase like "the whale road's trespass" might denote maritime boundary violations, compressing complex concepts into memorable imagery. These techniques ensured consistency while allowing nuance. A skilled law speaker could interpret a metaphor's edge to suit new circumstances, much like modern judges pass legal precedent. Indigenous legal traditions reveal even deeper layers of sophistication. The Navajo peacemaker courts still resolve conflicts through hajuji, a process where stories about harmony and balance guide restitution rather than punitive codes. An elder might recount the journey of changing woman to reframe a theft as a rupture in community ties, steering the offender toward restoration rather than punishment. In Australia, Aboriginal land councils use Songlines oral maps encoding ownership and sacred sites as evidence in native title claims, their melodies carrying legal weight equal to any surveyor's document. What's revolutionary is how these systems bypassed writing's limitations. Oral laws could evolve with a community's needs, adjusted through consensus at the next gathering without waiting for scribes to amend texts. The Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy's Great Law of Peace, memorized on wampum belts, allowed clans to adapt governance while keeping core principles intact. Contrast this with Europe's rigid feudal codes, where outdated statutes often persisted because altering parchment was laborious. Orality's fluidity became its strength, letting justice breathe with the times. Yet these traditions demanded extraordinary rigor. Brehon students underwent 20-year apprenticeships, mastering thousands of verses with error correction techniques like cross-checking, where peers would challenge recitations mid-flow to test accuracy. In Mali, Griot legal historians still recount the Kuraukan Fauga, the 13th century constitution of the Mali Empire, using rhythmic repetitions that make alterations audibly jarring, like a wrong note in a symphony. This wasn't just memorization, it was communal fact-checking, where the entire assembly served as living witnesses to the law's integrity. The endurance of these systems shatters the myth that complex governance requires writing. When Canada's Supreme Court recognized the Tsilhqot'in Nation's oral histories as proof of land ownership in 2014, it affirmed what indigenous cultures always knew: spoken word can bind societies as firmly as any written contract. The irony: modern legal scholars now study oral traditions to improve courtroom storytelling, realizing that the most persuasive arguments often mirror the vivid narratives of griots or skalds. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in how these traditions balanced fixity and flexibility. Unlike static legal texts, oral laws lived in performance, requiring constant engagement from both keepers and communities. A Brehon judge's verdict wasn't just a decision, it was a renewal of covenant, a reminder that justice thrives not in archives, but in the space between speaker and listener. In an age where laws can be reduced to fine print, that's a resonance worth remembering. The silence left by vanished voices echoes louder than we realize. Imagine an entire universe of stories, creation myths, love ballads, warnings whispered across generations disappearing in the space of a single lifetime. When the last speaker of the Yagan language, Cristina Calderon, passed away in 2022, she took with her not just vocabulary, but an entire way of seeing the world from Tierra del Fuego's southernmost islands. Her people's oral maps of kelp forests and storm patterns, their tales of the moon's marriage to the sea, now survive only in patchy recordings and outsider accounts. This isn't just loss, it's amnesia on a species level. Archaeologists sometimes stumble on ghostly traces of these erased narratives. In the American Southwest, rock art depicts scenes that no living tradition can explain: figures with antlers riding celestial serpents, or dancers holding objects that resemble nothing in modern Pueblo ceremonies. These aren't just ancient doodles, they're frozen moments from storytelling traditions that once pulsed with meaning. Linguists face similar puzzles when they encounter words like the Basque "eitzer," a term for the exact moment an axe bites into fresh wood, a concept so precise it must have anchored entire sagas of carpentry or forestry now lost to time. The violence behind many of these silences is undeniable. When Tasmanian Aboriginal languages were systematically erased in the 19th century, stories about the island's formation, how the ancestor Parnun created the base straight by cutting the land with a spear, were replaced with colonial myths. In Canada, residential schools severed Indigenous children from their oral histories so thoroughly that some survivors later recalled knowing only fragments of their own birth ceremonies or clan origin stories. These weren't passive disappearances, they were intellectual wildfires set deliberately to clear cultural ground, yet glimmers survive in unexpected places. The Rosetta Stone of oral tradition might be something as humble as a chilkat blanket woven by Tlingit artisans. Its abstract patterns, when read by knowledgeable weavers, recount migration histories and spirit encounters. A single surviving Maori Wakero carving can preserve genealogies through the interplay of figures and spacing, if only someone remembers the key. Even cooking techniques hold clues. The fact that both the Ainu of Japan and the Sami of Scandinavia ferment fish in nearly identical ways hints at lost narratives of Arctic contact that no written record confirms. What makes these gaps haunting is how they distort our understanding of humanity's journey. We know the Romans built aqueducts because they left blueprints, but how many other civilizations perfected water systems guided by songs about river spirits? The Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh survived on clay tablets, but what epic poems about sea voyages or celestial events vanished with Polynesian navigators or Andean astronomers? The irony is brutal. Societies that prioritized sustainability over monuments, oral teaching over libraries, often left the faintest traces. But this isn't just about mourning, it's about vigilance. The Living Tongues Institute's work with language keepers in Papua New Guinea shows how much can still be saved when communities reclaim their narratives. When Darrell Baldwin revived the Maiamia language from archival scraps, he didn't just restore words, he resurrected creation stories that reconnected his people to their ancestral landscapes. Every time a Cherokee elder records a healing chant or a Yamana storyteller films a traditional tale, they're building levees against the flood of forgetting. The urgency isn't academic. Climate change is erasing oral traditions faster than archivists can document them. Rising seas threaten Pacific Islanders' navigational chants tied to vanishing atolls, while melting permafrost swallows the very landscapes that anchor Siberian shaman stories. What's at stake isn't nostalgia, but survival wisdom, the kind that taught the Gwich'in to read caribou migration through ancestral songs, or warned coastal Maori about tsunami-safe elevations through Purakau legends. These narratives were never just entertainment, they were lifelines. Perhaps the greatest tragedy would be repeating the mistake of dismissing oral tradition as primitive. When a Yazidi grandmother recounts the genocide of her people through lament poetry, or a Tibetan refugee sings of lost homelands in Nangma ballads, they're doing what humans have always done, turning pain into meaning, memory into resistance. The fragments we've lost remind us that every voice still speaking carries something irreplaceable, not just stories, but the very architecture of how we understand what it means to be human. A third-grade classroom in Oregon buzzes with excitement as students lean forward, not to stare at screens, but to watch their teacher weave a tale about water molecules embarking on a journey through the water cycle, complete with dramatic voices for Drippy the raindrop and hand gestures mimicking evaporation. This isn't just playtime, it's cutting-edge pedagogy. Across the globe, educators are waking up to what indigenous cultures never forgot. The human brain doesn't naturally organize information in bullet points or flashcards. It craves story, the rise and fall of tension, the emotional hooks, the satisfying resolution that makes knowledge stick like Velcro. Neuroscience backs this up. When researchers at the University of California scanned students' brains during lessons, they found narrative-based instruction activated both the language processing regions and the sensory cortex, creating dual encoding that boosted retention by up to 60% compared to rote memorization. Indigenous teaching methods offer masterclasses in this approach. The Maori Purakau tradition, for instance, embeds complex ecological knowledge in stories where mountains and rivers are ancestors with personalities. A child learning about sustainable fishing doesn't memorize quotas. They hear how the demigod Moi tricked his brothers into pulling up the North Island while respecting Tangaroa, god of the sea. The result, lessons that resonate emotionally while conveying practical wisdom. Similarly, Cherokee elders teach botany through the adventures of Kanainsky Amayehi, the water spider, whose web weaving explains plant germination in ways that make children see forests as networks of relationships rather than collections of species. These traditions reveal a radical truth. Facts divorced from narrative are like seeds scattered on pavement. They might look tidy, but they'll never take root. The implications for modern education are staggering. History classrooms shackled to textbook timelines could instead adopt the griot's art, where events unfold through eyewitness perspectives. A Boston Tea Party recounted as a tavern rumor, a civil rights march voiced by a teenager's diary. Science teachers might borrow from Aboriginal songlines, turning the periodic table into a cosmic origin story where elements meet and react like characters in a play. Even math, often stripped of context, comes alive when framed as the Navajo path of beauty, where geometric principles emerge from weaving patterns and Hogan construction. The key lies in understanding that oral tradition isn't about abandoning rigor. It's about deepening it through emotional and sensory engagement. Some schools are already pioneering this shift. In New Zealand, Te Kura Roa programs integrate Maori oral histories into STEM curricula, with students building wind turbines while learning the legend of Toharametia, the wind god. In Norway, educators use Sami joik singing to teach environmental science, mapping reindeer migration patterns through melodic contours. Even standardized tests adapt. Alaska's Yupik speaking districts now include story problems, where test takers interpret traditional narratives to solve ecological scenarios. The outcomes: higher engagement, better long-term recall, and something rarely measured but vital: students who see knowledge as alive rather than archived. Yet challenges persist. Standardized education systems, obsessed with measurable outputs, often dismiss storytelling as frivolous. Teachers juggling overcrowded syllabi may struggle to craft narratives for every lesson. But the solutions hide in plain sight. Digital tools allow students to create oral history podcasts or animate folktales with coding. Professional development programs, like those run by Canada's First Nations Education Steering Committee, train educators to weave Indigenous storytelling techniques into existing frameworks without overhauling curricula. The shift doesn't require throwing out textbooks, just recognizing that the most powerful teaching tool has been inside us all along: the irrepressible human urge to turn information into story and story into meaning. What's at stake isn't just better test scores, but a reimagining of what learning feels like. When a physics teacher frames Newton's laws as a cosmic detective story, or a literature professor performs Beowulf with the fervor of an Anglo-Saxon scop, they're not just entertaining, they're honoring the oldest educational technology on Earth. The firelight might now be a smartboard's glow, but the magic remains the same: a voice, a listener, and the spark that leaps between them, igniting understanding that outlasts the final bell. The recording of oral traditions sits at a crossroads between preservation and appropriation, a delicate space where the act of documentation can either honor or harm. Picture an anthropologist pressing record as a Navajo elder shares a sacred creation story. The intent might be noble: to safeguard vanishing knowledge. but without proper protocols, that recording risks stripping the story from its cultural context, turning a living tradition into a museum exhibit. This tension isn't theoretical. In the 1970s, Australian researchers documented Aboriginal songlines with meticulous detail, only to have those recordings later used in mining disputes to undermine indigenous land claims. The very tools meant to preserve became instruments of dispossession. Ownership lies at the heart of these ethical dilemmas. Unlike written texts, oral stories often belong collectively to communities, not individuals. The Maori concept of taonga, for instance, treats cultural knowledge as a treasure held in trust for future generations. When outsiders record such narratives without consent, they effectively sever the chain of stewardship. The Hopi tribe's struggle with museums over ceremonial recordings illustrates this starkly. Sacred Katsina songs, once captured on wax cylinders, were later broadcast publicly, violating protocols that reserve certain knowledge for initiated members alone. These aren't mere breaches of etiquette, they're violations of spiritual copyright where the sacred becomes spectacle. Yet the solution isn't to avoid documentation altogether. With over half the world's languages at risk of disappearing this century, the urgency to preserve is real. The key lies in flipping the power dynamic. Collaborative models like the Mukatu platform co-developed with Warumungu Aboriginal elders put communities in control. Here, digital archives are governed by traditional laws. Some stories are accessible only to women, others to specific clans, with permissions embedded in metadata. Similarly, the Sami Parliament in Norway now oversees all research on their Joik traditions, ensuring recordings serve Sami priorities, not academic curiosity. These projects prove technology and tradition aren't adversaries but allies when the latter leads the way. Ethical storytelling also demands rethinking how narratives are framed. The Zuni people's response to anthropologists in the 1980s offers a blueprint. Instead of allowing outsiders to transcribe their origin stories linearly, Zuni elders insisted on presenting multiple versions, reflecting how narratives naturally vary across tellers and occasions. This dialogic approach counters the Western fetish for singular, authoritative texts, preserving the fluidity that makes oral traditions thrive. Meanwhile, the Yolngu of Australia have begun producing their own films, like 10 Canoes, to share stories on their terms, blurring the line between ancient storytelling and modern media while retaining cultural agency. The stakes extend beyond academia. When corporations patent medicines derived from indigenous knowledge without compensation, or when filmmakers exoticize oral histories for profit, the harm is tangible. But positive examples point the way forward. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission partnered with indigenous recorders to document residential school survivors' testimonies, embedding protocols where participants dictate access. In Kenya, Maasai communities license their ecological folklore to educators through Creative Commons agreements, ensuring benefits flow back to storytellers. These models recognize oral traditions not as relics to be mined, but as living systems requiring reciprocity. What emerges is a radical redefinition of preservation, one where the microphone is passed, not taken. The ethical path doesn't mean silencing outside voices, but amplifying insider ones, whether through co-authored research, community-managed archives, or fair compensation structures. Because the ultimate test isn't just whether a story survives, but whether the people who birthed it thrive alongside it. In an age where every smartphone can capture voices, the question isn't, can we record, but how can we listen? And more crucially, who gets to decide when the story begins and ends? The campfire may have become a Zoom call, and the village square might now be a podcast feed. but the heartbeat of oral storytelling still pulses through every innovation we create. Imagine slipping on a virtual reality headset and suddenly standing beside a Lakota elder as she recounts the Battle of the Little Bighorn, not through dry textbook facts, but through the tremor in her voice as she describes the dust swirling around Crazy Horse's war pony. This isn't science fiction. Projects like the indigenous-led virtual Songlines already use VR to immerse users in 40,000-year-old Aboriginal narratives, where the act of walking through a digitally rendered landscape triggers oral histories tied to each rock and riverbed. The technology dazzles, but the magic still flows from that ancient exchange, the pause before a revelation, the lilt of a storyteller's laugh, the unscripted moment when a listener's gasp shapes the next turn in the tale. Artificial intelligence, often seen as oral tradition's antithesis, is becoming its unlikely ally. In Finland, the Sami people are training AI models on recordings of elders speaking the endangered Skold Sami language, creating interactive bots that can teach children traditional joik singing with the same inflections their great-grandparents used. Meanwhile, Cherokee developers built a speech-to-text app that transcribes spoken stories directly into the tribe's written syllabary, bridging the gap between oral and literary preservation. The irony is rich. The same algorithms that threaten to homogenize global culture are being weaponized to protect the very traditions they might have erased. Yet the danger remains: an AI can replicate a voice, but can it convey the way a griot's eyes gleam when recounting an ancestor's triumph, or how a Navajo storyteller's hands trace the shape of a mountain lost to mining? The real frontier lies in community-driven platforms that honor oral traditions' sacred reciprocity. Take StoryForge, a blockchain-based app developed with Maori input, where storytellers earn tokens each time their narratives are shared, not as payment, but as a digital wampum belt tracking a story's journey through the world. Or consider Echoes, an audio platform where listeners can't fast-forward through tales. They must contribute their own reflections to unlock the next segment, enforcing the call and response rhythms central to West African griot performances. These aren't just tools, they're ecosystems designed to sustain the social contracts that have always underpinned oral knowledge, where value isn't extracted but circulated. What's emerging is neither pure tradition nor unchecked innovation, but a third space where ancient and futuristic harmonize. When Tlingit teens in Alaska remix potlatch songs into electronic beats, or when Syrian refugees in Berlin preserve their oral histories through augmented reality graffiti, they're proving that adaptability has always been oral tradition's superpower. The scrolls of Alexandria turned to ash, but the Epic of Gilgamesh survived because it lived in countless mouths long before it was pressed into clay. As we hurtle into an era of deepfakes and Chinese letter, perhaps the most radical act is remembering what our bones already know, that the stories that last aren't stored in servers, but in the silent spaces between words, the shared breath of teller and listener, the sacred charge to carry a voice forward until it's ready to be passed on again. The future of oral tradition won't be found in any single technology, but in our willingness to kneel, virtually or otherwise, at the feet of those still whispering the oldest truth. Some fires refuse to go out, no matter how the wind blows. From the flickering shadows of prehistoric caves to the glowing screens of smartphones, humanity's oldest technology, the spoken word, has never stopped evolving. What began as survival instructions whispered between generations, etched into memory through rhythm and repetition, now thrives in podcasts, audiobooks, and even viral TikToks. The medium changes, but the magic remains the same: a voice, a listener, and the invisible thread that connects them across time. Oral traditions didn't just endure, they laid the blueprint for how we communicate even in our digital age. Think about it, the suspenseful pacing of a true crime podcast mirrors a griot's dramatic pause before revealing a king's fate, while the call and response of live streams echoes indigenous elders engaging their audiences. These aren't coincidences, they're proof that our brains are still wired for stories that breathe. What's truly remarkable is how these ancient techniques solve modern problems. In an era of information overload, the mnemonic devices bards used to memorize epic poems, like melodic phrasing or spatial memory tricks, are now studied by neuroscientists to combat digital amnesia. The Maori practice of weaving genealogy into song finds new life in DNA ancestry platforms where users crave narrative, not just data. Even the communal aspect of oral tradition resurfaces in fan theories dissecting TV show lore, proving we still crave shared storytelling around virtual campfires. The tools have changed, but the human need to hear, to remember, and to belong hasn't dimmed. This continuity holds a mirror to our fragility. For all our cloud storage and AI, we're one solar flare away from losing the digital archives we assumed were permanent. Meanwhile, the Aboriginal songlines that guided travelers for 65,000 years outlasted every hard drive ever made. There's humility in realizing that our ancestors' greatest innovation wasn't the wheel or the plow, it was the systems they built to carry wisdom on the most resilient medium of all, the human voice. So the next time you lose yourself in an audiobook or share a family story over dinner, remember, you're not just passing time, you're adding your voice to a chain that stretches back to the first person who ever said, "Listen, I'll tell you something important." Whether through a campfire's crackle or a Bluetooth speaker's hum, the essence remains. Stories survive when they're given breath, and as long as we keep speaking them, they'll light the way forward just as they always have. If this journey through the echoes of oral tradition resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment about the stories that shaped your world. The conversation never really ends, it just waits for the next voice.